The room did not erupt when the codicil was read. It froze. One sentence, written under Elizabeth's private authority, carried more force than any public ceremony, any crown, any polished palace statement. Camilla sat still as the executors reached the line that removed her from a role she believed was secure and named Catherine instead. In that silence, the monarchy shifted, without a trumpet, without a warning, and without mercy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla did not blink. She held herself upright, as if movement would make the sentence real. Charles lowered his eyes toward the table, and the king looked older, wounded by words written by his mother. Catherine stayed composed, but her fingers tightened around the folder before her. William saw it. The prince saw duty land on his wife, not like glory, but like weight. The senior executor kept reading, because the document left no room for hesitation. A codicil, in plain terms, is an added legal instruction to a will, used when someone wants to change part of their final wishes without rewriting everything. This one had been sealed apart from the main papers and marked for restricted reading only after 4 palace conditions had been met. Elizabeth had not acted in frustration. The Queen had prepared for this hour. Charles knew the difference immediately. This was not about who stood beside him in public. This was about private stewardship, meaning the guarded responsibility for sensitive family instructions, restricted papers, and legacy decisions never meant for display. Camilla had believed proximity to the king gave her a natural place near that inheritance. Catherine had never claimed it. Yet Elizabeth's sentence did what no speech could do. It moved trust from one woman to another. Camilla's face changed when the executor reached the second line. The queen consort was not merely being passed over. She was deliberately excluded from future discretion over the matter. Catherine breathed slowly, and William leaned closer without touching her, careful not to turn the moment into spectacle. Charles finally lifted his head, but he did not challenge the law. He asked only one question, and the room felt colder before he finished it. When did she write this? The executor turned the final page. William watched his father's expression collapse into silence, and Catherine understood that Elizabeth's choice had wounded more than Camilla. It had opened a judgment the family could no longer hide. But before the family could understand why Elizabeth made that choice, they had to face what each person in that room stood to lose. Every royal crisis has documents, lawyers, and protocols, but this one had faces. Camilla, wounded by public rejection inside a private room. Charles, trapped between loyalty to his wife and obedience to his mother's final command. Catherine, suddenly pulled into the center of a legacy she had never publicly claimed. And William, watching the past and future collide across one polished table, knowing silence would no longer protect anyone. Camilla had entered that room believing the storm could still be contained. She had spent years beside Charles, standing through public judgment, ceremony, whispers, acceptance, and resistance. To her, that long road had earned more than a place at his side. It had earned proximity to the private legacy Elizabeth left behind. Not the glittering parts seen by the world, not the formal moments wrapped in velvet and tradition, but the guarded trust that lived behind closed doors. The queen consort believed her position beside the king placed her naturally near that inheritance. Yet the codicil had just told her something brutal. Elizabeth had drawn a line that marriage, rank, and endurance could not cross. Catherine stood in a different kind of silence. She had not pushed herself forward. She had not demanded recognition or shaped herself as the obvious keeper of Elizabeth's final wishes. Instead, the future queen had been watched over time, through family strain, through illness, through motherhood, through criticism. She answered with restraint instead of noise. That was why the moment mattered. Elizabeth had not chosen the loudest person in the room. The late monarch had chosen the one who had survived pressure without letting it turn her reckless. And that made Catherine's elevation feel less like reward and more like responsibility. Charles felt the full cruelty of the choice. The Codicil, a legal addition to Elizabeth's final instructions, had forced him into a corner no crown could soften. If the king defended Camilla too strongly, he risked appearing to challenge his mother's last written command. If he obeyed the document without protest, he left his wife exposed to humiliation. He looked at Camilla, then at Catherine, and the silence between them became almost unbearable. His grief was no longer private. It had become policy. William understood another danger. He wanted to protect Catherine, but he knew protection could make the wound worse. One wrong word from him would look like victory. One careless gesture would place his wife directly in Camilla's emotional line of fire. So the prince stayed measured, even as he saw Catherine absorbing a burden she had never sought. Then the executors made the wound deeper. Elizabeth's wording was unusually direct. There was no space for Charles to reinterpret it, no opening for aides to soften it, no household official who could turn it into something more comfortable. A private note attached to the codicil contained the phrase, "temperament under pressure," and the room seemed to tilt toward Catherine. Camilla finally spoke, not loudly, but sharply enough to cut through every polished restraint. Was this decided because of one moment? And that question pulled everyone backward, to the single incident Elizabeth never forgot. The codicil did not appear from nowhere. It was born from a day no palace diary explained properly. A day when Elizabeth watched two women respond to the same pressure in completely different ways. One reached for influence. The other reached for restraint. Years later, when the sealed paper was finally opened, that forgotten moment returned like a verdict written in advance. Camilla heard the question leave her own mouth, and the room seemed to answer before anyone else could. Was this decided because of one moment? It was not a plea. It was not quite an accusation. It was fear, dressed as control. Charles looked toward the executors, but the king already understood the danger of what might come next. If there was a moment, then Elizabeth's decision was not cold. It was remembered. It had roots. It had a beginning no one had wanted to revisit. Elizabeth had seen that beginning during the private Windsor family council after the brief Sapphire Room dispute, a fictional but decisive quarrel over who should access her personal correspondence and symbolic heirlooms. The Sapphire Room mattered because it held items tied not to public ceremony, but to private memory, letters, gifts, and family pieces that carried emotional power beyond their material worth. In royal life, a family council is a closed meeting where senior relatives settle sensitive matters away from public attention, and this one had begun as a discussion about order before it became a test of character. Camilla had pressed for wider involvement in those private household matters, believing years beside Charles had earned her a voice in protecting what Elizabeth would one day leave behind. She did not speak recklessly, but she spoke with urgency, and that urgency changed the room. Catherine chose a different path. She asked one careful question. Had the late monarch's wishes been recorded in writing? The words were calm, but their effect was sharp. Camilla felt the contrast immediately. Her own insistence suddenly looked like pressure, while Catherine's restraint looked like wisdom. Elizabeth noticed everything. The Queen watched Camilla's frustration gather, and Catherine's silence hold firm. Then the monarch paused the meeting and asked to speak to Catherine alone. That single request hardened the tension. Camilla felt excluded before anything had been decided, and Charles could not soften the sting. William waited outside afterward, studying Catherine's face when she returned. She looked pale. She looked shaken. Yet the future queen told him nothing, not even when he quietly asked whether Elizabeth had warned her. The executors now revealed the missing bridge. Elizabeth requested a private legal review shortly after that council, and asked that any future discretion be tied to judgment proven under strain. The phrase was not dramatic in itself, but in that room, it landed like thunder. The amendment had been written after the Sapphire Room dispute. Camilla understood then that her removal was not sudden punishment. It was a decision Elizabeth had carried quietly for years. That realization did not calm the room. It sharpened the confrontation that could no longer be postponed. There are confrontations that explode, and there are confrontations that become unbearable because no one raises their voice. This was the second kind. Camilla asked for the room to be cleared. Catherine did not move. Charles looked toward William, but the prince did not rescue the moment with diplomacy. The door closed, the aides vanished, and 4 people were left with Elizabeth's final sentence between them. Camilla held herself together, but only just. The queen consort had heard enough legal language to know when a decision had already been made, and this one had arrived wrapped in Elizabeth's authority. She asked for privacy because she could not let executors, aides, and silent observers turn her pain into procedure. Charles understood why she asked. The king also understood why Catherine stayed. The Codicil was no longer just a document. It had become the line separating loyalty from obedience. The executors stepped out, leaving the family alone with the final page still open beside Elizabeth's signature. An executor is a person legally trusted to carry out someone's final wishes, and in this room, their absence made the silence more dangerous, not less. No one could hide behind formal phrases now. Camilla looked at Catherine, and the hurt beneath her control finally broke through. She told her that being named by Elizabeth did not mean she understood what it had cost to stand beside Charles for years. The battles, the waiting, the judgment, the long road from rejection to acceptance. Catherine absorbed the words without flinching. She knew Camilla was not only angry at her, she was grieving the belief that endurance should have earned trust. But the future queen answered with quiet resolve, and that calm made the moment sharper. She said she had not asked for the responsibility, had not reached for Elizabeth's confidence, and had never wanted this to become a wound inside the family. But she would not dishonor the queen by pretending the instruction was unclear. The truth had been written. The burden now was to live with it. Charles finally spoke, and his voice carried the pain he had tried to hide. He admitted he had known Elizabeth held reservations. He had felt them in pauses, in careful remarks, in the way the monarch guarded certain family matters. But he had not known she had turned those doubts into a binding written amendment. A binding amendment means a formal change that must be followed, not merely respected. That confession struck Camilla harder than the document itself, because it meant the king had sensed the shadow before the room ever saw the paper. William set his pen down. The small sound cut through everything. He told Charles the family could not soften the codicil in public while enforcing it in private, because that would betray Elizabeth twice. Camilla pushed back her chair, not defeated, but furious, and asked who now had the power to enforce Elizabeth's words. The answer lay not in emotion, but in the quiet machinery of authority that Elizabeth had left behind. Power in the monarchy rarely looks like power. It does not always arrive in a crown or a carriage. Sometimes, it sits inside a sealed envelope, inside a solicitor's briefcase, inside the steady voice of an executor who refuses to bend. Camilla had royal presence. Charles had the throne. But Elizabeth had left behind something stronger than both. Instructions designed to survive emotion. Charles stayed behind after the others withdrew, and the silence around him felt heavier than the document itself. The king sat with the senior executor, his thumb rubbing slowly along the folder's edge, as if touch alone could soften what had been written. He had heard Camilla's anger. He had seen Catherine's restraint. He had watched William choose duty over comfort. Yet, in that private exchange, Charles admitted the truth he had been fighting since the first line was read. He felt as though he was losing his mother all over again. The executor did not rush to comfort him. He could not. His duty was not to rescue Charles from pain, but to carry out Elizabeth's final will. A protected chain of responsibility means a fixed path of authority that prevents personal preference, household pressure, or emotional appeal from changing who receives control. Elizabeth had built that chain carefully. The Codicil did not merely name Catherine. It blocked anyone else from stepping into the role through influence, habit, or quiet palace adjustment. Charles understood why that mattered, and it cut him deeply. If the king softened the instruction for Camilla, he would weaken Elizabeth's last command. If he enforced it without mercy, he would leave his wife feeling cast aside by a woman whose acceptance she had spent years trying to earn. That was the cruelty of the moment. Success for Catherine meant suffering for Camilla. Obedience to Elizabeth meant heartbreak for Charles. The monarchy had always demanded sacrifice, but now it demanded it inside his own marriage. The executor's voice remained steady, though discomfort showed in every careful pause. He told Charles that Elizabeth had anticipated resistance. She had known grief would argue. She had known loyalty would search for escape. That was why the wording was so precise. One clause blocked Camilla from receiving certain private files, even through indirect household channels. Another required Catherine to be briefed personally, not through aides, not through summaries, and not through filtered palace language. Elizabeth wanted her intentions to reach Catherine untouched. Charles asked whether there was any compromise that could preserve Camilla's dignity. The question was quiet, but desperate. The executor looked down at the folder before answering, and the pause itself felt like a verdict. Then he said the sentence that changed the mood. Only if she accepts the boundary. Charles closed his eyes for a moment, because he understood exactly what that meant. The Codicil was no longer a matter of interpretation. It had become a test of submission, pride, and loyalty. But acceptance was not what came first. The first thing to arrive was fallout. By evening, the palace did what palaces do best. It moved quietly. Doors were checked. Lists were amended. Briefings were delayed. Access was narrowed without announcement. Yet behind the polished silence, one woman understood exactly what had happened. Camilla was not simply disappointed. She was being repositioned, and for someone who had spent years fighting to be accepted, the new boundary felt like a public wound delivered in private. Camilla felt the change before anyone explained it to her. The queen consort had lived long enough inside royal walls to know that power rarely announces its departure. It disappears first from schedules, then from conversations, then from rooms where a person once belonged. Her private secretary entered with the revised access list, and Camilla saw Catherine's name where hers had been. No speech could have made the message clearer. Elizabeth's codicil had moved from paper into practice. Catherine received her own notice almost at the same time, and the contrast was cruel. While Camilla was losing access, the future queen was being prepared for her first private briefing. A private briefing, in this world, meant a closed meeting where sensitive instructions were explained directly to the person now responsible for carrying them forward. William was told the transition had to happen quickly, not because the palace wanted drama, but because delay would create confusion. If two women appeared to hold the same trust, the whole household would start choosing sides. Charles tried to reach Camilla before the hurt hardened into anger. The king found her alone after her secretary left, staring at the list as if the page itself had betrayed her. He offered comfort, but she refused it, with a stillness sharper than shouting. Camilla told him comfort meant little when everyone had already chosen obedience over loyalty. Charles had no easy answer. He could defend her heart, but he could not undo his mother's hand. That helplessness made him look less like a monarch and more like a son trapped inside a command. The fallout deepened when a palace aide noticed another quiet change. One set of keys, previously held under Camilla's office authority, had been requested back by the executors before morning. The keys mattered because they represented more than doors. They meant controlled access, trusted handling, and private permission. Once they were returned, Camilla's removal would no longer be emotional or symbolic. It would be physical, practical, and impossible to deny. William then learned the next revelation. Catherine's briefing would not include documents alone. It would include a personal letter Elizabeth had written for the person named in the codicil. The prince understood at once that this changed everything. A legal instruction could be obeyed. A letter could wound, heal, or reveal why the late queen had acted with such final force. Catherine felt the weight of that news settle over her. She had not sought victory, and she did not want Camilla's pain to become the price of Elizabeth's trust. Shaken, she asked William to stay with her until the room was cleared of everyone else. And once the institution stepped aside, the turning point came in the quietest conversation of all. No courtier stood between them. No lawyer explained the language. No aide softened the meaning. Catherine and William entered the room together, but only she was invited to open the envelope. For the first time since the Codicil surfaced, the crisis stopped feeling like a battle over status and became something more intimate. A final act of trust from Elizabeth to the woman she believed would protect what others might wills fight to possess. Catherine held the envelope for several seconds before she opened it. The future queen had already accepted that the Codicil had changed her place inside the family, but the letter made it personal. William stayed beside her because she had asked him to, yet the prince understood this was not his moment to lead. It belonged to her and to Elizabeth's voice reaching across time with a trust that felt almost impossible to carry. Catherine began reading, and the first page broke through the discipline she had held all day. She cried quietly, not as someone who had won, but as someone who had been handed a duty wrapped in grief. The letter explained that the Codicil was never meant to humiliate Camilla. It was meant to protect a legacy Elizabeth believed required restraint, patience, and emotional discipline. A private letter, in this kind of royal matter, was not a public statement or a palace message. It was a personal instruction, written for one person to understand the heart behind a formal decision. William watched Catherine struggle with that meaning. He knew she feared the choice would be seen as victory over Camilla, when Elizabeth had framed it as protection from conflict. The late queen had feared that the monarchy's private memory could be reshaped by those closest to power if no one outside the immediate struggle guarded it. That fear mattered, because private memory is where families decide what the future remembers, what it forgets, and whose version survives when the official language grows cold. Catherine read further and discovered the deeper wound. Elizabeth had chosen her, after years of watching silence, restraint, and loyalty, in moments when speaking would have helped her. The monarch had noticed what the world often missed. She had seen Catherine absorb pressure without turning it into revenge. She had seen William's wife remain steady when public attention became cruel, when family tension became unbearable, and when ambition could have been disguised as duty. William took her hand then, gently but firmly. He told Catherine that accepting the role did not mean becoming hard. It meant staying steady when others could not. The words gave her room to breathe, but they did not make the burden lighter. Catherine folded the letter carefully and said she would accept the responsibility, but only if Camilla was told with dignity before the world heard anything. Yet dignity inside the palace could not stop the force of the story once it reached the public. The next morning, the monarchy's private wound became the nation's obsession. It was not the official statement that captured Britain. It was the image beside it. Camilla leaving a side entrance with her jaw set, Catherine arriving separately in dark blue, and William walking half a step behind her. By breakfast, the story had escaped palace language and become something sharper. Elizabeth's final choice had a face. Camilla watched the coverage from a private sitting room, and every carefully chosen word seemed to press harder against her dignity. The queen consort had known the palace would speak eventually, but she had hoped the statement would hide the pain behind soft phrases. It did not. The announcement confirmed that Catherine would assume the private stewardship named in code Elizabeth's Codicil, while Camilla would no longer hold access to that responsibility. A private stewardship meant a guarded role over sensitive family instructions, restricted papers, and legacy matters, not a public title with applause attached. That was why the statement wounded so deeply. It told the country that Elizabeth's trust had moved, and that the move was final. Catherine saw the same broadcast, and the future queen looked away, before the presenter finished. She had accepted the letter. She had accepted the duty, but she had not accepted the cruelty of how quickly private obedience became public. Comparison. William stood close enough to hear her say she never wanted Elizabeth's trust to become Camilla's humiliation. The prince understood the ache inside those words. Catherine had been elevated, yes, but elevation inside the monarchy often came wrapped in someone else's loss. Her success had become Camilla's suffering before the nation had even finished breakfast. Camilla's expression hardened when one presenter called the Codicil a posthumous judgment from the Queen herself. The phrase landed like a second removal. It was no longer only about access, files, or protocol. It had become a moral story the public could repeat in a single breath. Elizabeth chose Catherine, and Camilla was left outside the circle. The palace had used formal language, but the public heard emotion. They heard favor. They heard rejection. And once that meaning took hold, no official statement could fully control it. A London newspaper sealed the moment with a front page that cut through every denial. 2 photographs were split down the center. Camilla leaving by car, Catherine entering the palace. Above them, the headline read, "The Queen's Final Choice." Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered near the gates. Some held flowers for Elizabeth. Others spoke quietly about whether the Codicil proved who had truly carried her confidence. Charles watched the reaction unfold and realized silence would not save them now. The monarchy needed more than control. It needed meaning. That meaning arrived not through denial, but through the final emotional verdict the family could no longer avoid. In the end, the Codicil did not destroy the monarchy. It stripped away illusion. It showed that Elizabeth's final authority was not sentimental, not careless, and not easily softened by those left behind. Camilla was removed, Catherine was named, Charles was wounded, and William understood the cost of inheritance more deeply than ever. The palace survived because the truth, however painful, was finally allowed to stand. Charles accepted the decision in the only way left to him, quietly, painfully, and without another attempt to bend it. The king met Camilla away from the noise of advisors and statements, and for once, his crown offered him no protection from the hurt in her eyes. He told her that defending her could not mean rewriting his mother's final instruction. Those words cost him. Camilla heard the love inside them, but she also heard the boundary. The queen consort remained beside him publicly, but Elizabeth's private trust had moved beyond her reach. Camilla did not fight the document anymore. A codicil, in plain terms, is an added legal instruction to a will, and this one had become Elizabeth's last unmoving command. The queen consort understood that resistance would not restore her dignity. It would only deepen the wound and make the removal look like a battle she could not win. So she stepped back from the disputed role with controlled grace, accepting that her public position beside Charles remained intact, while her private claim had been permanently marked. Catherine then received the protected materials, and the moment carried no sense of victory. The future queen placed Elizabeth's letter inside the folder with careful hands, turning the late monarch's trust into duty rather than triumph. The protected materials mattered because they held restricted family instructions, private papers, and legacy decisions meant to shape what the monarchy remembered about itself. Catherine understood why Elizabeth had chosen discipline over closeness, humility over influence, and restraint over rivalry. The gift was heavy because it was not really a gift. It was a responsibility. William witnessed the handover and understood the deeper warning. The codicil had never been only about Catherine or Camilla. It had been Elizabeth's final lesson to the family she left behind. Character matters more than proximity to power. The prince saw his wife gain a solemn burden, saw his father accept the cost of obedience, and saw Camilla lose a private claim without losing her place at Charles's side. The monarchy emerged changed, bruised, and steadier because Elizabeth's final judgment could no longer be diluted. This was not the beginning of another mystery. It was the closing of Elizabeth's last unfinished command. and the monarchy had no choice but to live by it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.